just kind of enjoy ourselves and leave it to the smart guys to work out the details. Well, that was the 50s. What happened in the 60s? Our country blew up, led mostly by young people. And they had quite an effect. It's become a much more civilized country because of that. I mean, it's the 1960s when you got the seeds of the popular movements that have really changed the country. The anti-war movement, the feminist movement, which probably changed the country more than anything else, which came in the 70s, but had its roots among young people in the 60s. The environmental movements, again, the 70s. Civil rights movement, of course, early 60s. And remember, that was initiated by students. Black students in the South are the ones who sat in at the lunch counters, riding the freedom buses. They had some support from young people in the North. Later spread much more widely. By the 1980s, you were getting the anti-nuclear movement, huge movement, the solidarity movements, something totally new in the history of Western imperialism. There's never been a time in the past when people from an invading country went to live with the victims to try to help them or even to protect them with a white face. That was happening on a massive scale, still going on substantially. Now it's all over the world, and it was Central America. That's the international solidarity movement. Very brave people, mostly young. And on to the global justice movement of the last decade. Again, many young people right at the forefront. So yeah, that's the kind of thing you can do. It's been done in the past. It can be done now with regard to the Middle East and all the ways we've been talking about. There's no reason why that, young people can't be in the forefront of that. In fact, if you look at the invasion, the recent January attack on Gaza, there was a lot of protest in the United States. Some of it in mass meetings, some of it on a lot of blogging. And if you look, it was mostly younger people. They're the ones who were in the forefront to a large extent and can be. They're the ones who can change the country and, in fact, save the world, because we're now facing dangers that really threaten species survival. I mean, Palestinians are facing murder of a nation, but there are threats not too remote on the horizon, which do threaten, literally, species survival. One is nuclear weapons. The other is the environmental issues. The tendencies are not in a positive direction, and there's something better be done about it, and seriously.
Ali Abunama's book, One Country, poses a great question. Is a one-state solution the solution?
You don't have to argue with me about that. That was my view back in the 1940s when I was a Zionist youth leader. At that point, it was regarded as part of the Zionist movement. It's called a binational state. It was not a majority position, but it was a position within the Zionist movement up till 1948. Well, the issue became moot in 1948. There then was a state that should have the rights of any state in the international system. And they're almost all of them based on violence and repression. Take the United States, our state, it was based on virtual extermination of the indigenous population, conquest of half of Mexico, on and on. And you look at the other states around the world, that's what their borders are and that's what their nature is. So Israel had those rights. Now in 1967, when Israel conquered the rest of Palestine and Gaza and the Sinai, then that question of one state arose again. At that point, Israel could have moved towards some kind of a federal solution, settlement in the mandatory Palestine from the Jordan to the sea. And in fact, there were proposals to that effect by Israeli military intelligence. Not quite that, but they proposed significant autonomy in the occupied territories, which could have moved towards a kind of a federal solution and maybe closer integration. Actually, I was writing about it at the time, saying, this looks to me like a propitious moment to revive the ideas of the 1940s. That was absolute anathema on all sides. You couldn't even talk about it. That's a one-state solution. But you couldn't discuss it. Nobody wanted to hear a word. Now, it has picked up again in recent years, and it's become publicly acceptable. So now you can get articles about it in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and so on. And I think the reason is very clear. Now it is totally unfeasible. It was dangerous in the late 60s and the early 70s because it was feasible. You could have done it, and therefore if you were in favor of Israeli violence and expansion, you didn't want to hear about it. Actually, the PLO didn't want to hear about it either for other reasons. Now it's completely unfeasible, so therefore it's popular. Its function is to undermine support for the international consensus. It's maybe a nice ideal, but we have to make a distinction between proposals and advocacy. It's a very significant distinction if you're an activist. You can propose that everybody should live in peace and beat your swords into plowshares and so on. That's very nice. It becomes advocacy when you sketch a path from here to there. Otherwise, it's nothing. Now, there is a form of advocacy of a one-state, meaning a binational settlement. But that path, the only proposal I've ever heard, is to take it in stages, beginning with the international consensus on a two-state settlement, hoping that that would reduce the level of antagonism and violence, terminate the cycle of violence and repression and antagonism. Natural relations could be established, cultural, commercial, and others, among the two national entities, and they could move towards closer integration, which has to be a common effort. And I think there's good reason to believe that would happen. If anybody who knows that region, mandatory Palestine, knows that you draw a line through it any way you like, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, most borders are pretty crazy, but this one would be particularly crazy. It's an integrated region. So maybe in the course of time they would move on to this. That's advocacy of a one-state settlement. But the proposals that are now common and popular, even popular in the mainstream, they're not advocacy. And I think that's why they're popular. What they do serve to undermine what would have to be the first stage towards realizing it. And I think that's why they're considered acceptable. But I think you have to think that through if you're an activist. It's not enough to make pretty proposals. Show us how you're going to get there. This is not concealed. It was a very clear class-based coup. The President Zelaya, who came in as a big landowner, conservative, as regular member of the elite that's ruled the country forever, as in most of Latin America, started to move towards a kind of reformist social democracy. He began to do things like raise the minimum wage. He began to move towards joining ALBA, the Venezuelan, Bolivian, Ecuador alternative to the free trade, so-called free trade. It's not free trade. The economic regime, the neoliberal regime that the U.S. has been trying to impose on the region. They're kind of in the lead of extricating themselves from the neoliberal plague of the last several decades. And of course, the old elites, the rich business landowner class that's always run the country, they didn't like that. It's not surprising. So they threw them out. All kind of phony pretext. But that's basically what happened. It's a very clear class-based military coup. And it's not so clear, it's not even concealed. Now this is a little different interestingly different from the military coups that standardly take place in Latin America. One crucial difference is the United States didn't carry it out. That's not a small point. Furthermore, the United States did not at least openly support it. It was overwhelmingly opposed, not only in the hemisphere, but throughout the world.